Well, hello, folks. This is Dale Allen with the DXtera Institute. I want to welcome you to the today's session for the Next Generation by Design Symposium series on spurring innovation and AI tool development to address inequities in education. The Next Generation by Design series is a collaborative effort by partners around the world who are interested in being involved in intentional efforts to design those next generation of solutions that can help us to overcome the barriers that are far too present in delivery of education, whether that is reducing friction or spurring new tool development to assist in the education delivery. The logos of the organizations that are leading this effort, which is a growing community and an open community to any organizations who wish to join. DXtera, as I mentioned, I'll talk briefly about that in a minute, but we have the German Alliance for Education, the EduCloud Alliance, which works with the 20 largest publishers in the Nordic countries, RID Labs and their parent company RID out of South Korea and RID Labs out of the US, the Open University of Catalonia, headquartered in Barcelona, but one of the first online universities in the world. LearnTech, which is one of the largest EdTech conferences and events in Germany, and Mindset, which is a leading EdTech startup accelerator in Israel. And all of us, again, have this commitment to work towards intentionally bringing new tools to the marketplace and reducing friction in the market. DXtera, for those who don't know, DXtera is I'm proud to lead a membership organization that has members in 6 countries who are dedicated to solving these problems in specific ways. Our membership these are representative logos, has representatives from all different types of organizations, from low-resourced education organizations and systems, or community colleges here in the United States, to those with significant resources or deep technology backgrounds. Our technology hub started at MIT and has continued to grow outwards from there. We also have significant numbers of professional associations and network kind of affiliates like the German Alliance for Education, which have over 120 other educational entities, companies, ministries involved. But again, all dedicated and working towards solving problems collectively. For DXtera, we focus on 3 priority areas and use you'll hear from my colleague later who'll go into more detail on our specifications and domain models that we apply and build solutions for and present in an open format. But we're interested in creating next generation education systems that you can plug and play applications to manage your student environments and your systems within your educational entities. We have developed a full suite of open source data management solutions. And then we also have focused on building integration solutions to enable any of the enterprise data systems to be able to utilize or remove the friction to exchange data with other products. That is my just opening to get to know who DXtera was, but I'm very excited to welcome you to today's session and get us moving to begin a conversation out in the marketplace about how do we really bring about, and can help deploy innovative artificial intelligence tools that are safe and appropriate and can really work to address inequities in education. So this is a growing interest and will become a theme within our Next Generation by Design series. But this is the first in that series. And so we're extremely pleased to have a keynote speaker, Dr. Michelle Barrett, join us, who is the Vice President of Research and Learning Engineering at Edmentum. And also has been very involved with IEEE and some open activities as well, and you'll hear more about that. But she's someone who brings a kind of an applied approach to the software algorithms and analytics for assessment and learning. We are pleased to partner with her, collaborate, and have her join us today. And I'm going to stop sharing my slides and hand it over to Michelle.
Okay. All good. I see
All
the
good.
thumbs up that you can hear me, which is great. So first, I just want to say good morning to everyone, and I think afternoon and evening for some of you who are on the call. It's really my pleasure to be here today as part of the Next Generation by Design Symposia series, and I want to thank and acknowledge DXtera, and I know RID Labs had set some input and influence on this specific symposium that is being put together today. So as the head of research and learning engineering for Edmentum, we are a company with a 60-year history of designing and delivering computer-based instruction for K-12 students. And I'm also a board member of the Adaptive Instructional Systems Consortium, which is really committed to supporting adoption and advancement of products that use artificial intelligence and advanced technologies to help people learn. So it really is an honor for me to come and to share some of my thoughts and to also listen and learn from those of you who are participating in this symposium as well. So I hear we want to spur AI innovation in education, and I interpret that as we want to run a little faster toward a future in which AI technologies help us to advance accessibility, availability, and affordability of education, thereby addressing inequities that we can see in the world around us. And really today, I think, part of the conversation is about, what is it that would kick that horse into action? What is going to help speed it along its journey to that eventual future? And I think that one of the hypotheses that we have is that if we can remove some blockers, then we can really kind of get that horse running faster. One of those blockers that has been pointed to is the lack of access to large-scale, high-quality labeled data sets and the ability of the AI community to build and test effective models and tools. And we presume that by removing those hurdles, we're going to get closer to having an effective workforce and equitable student success, quality educational programming. And in addition, in doing so, we strive to address issues of equity, which is, that theme is emerging in any number of ways. In fact, today, the AI in Education conference kicked off, and the theme for that conference this year is Mind the Gap, AIED for Equity and Inclusion. So this is really top of mind for many people working in the field. And today, in this particular symposium, we're getting together with a hope that if we can work together to align disparate components in the market, that we can reduce friction. So in my first career, I was a mechanical engineer. And in that job, I thought a lot about reducing friction, because when you work on tools, then you need to know how friction is working. And those of you that have some engineering training will recognize that it's fairly easy to represent the influence of friction in a free body diagram. And when we design a free body diagram, we isolate a simple or a single component of a system, and we model all of the forces that are acting upon it. We can quantify the friction coefficient of two materials that are moving in opposition with one another. We can plan for that in our designs. It's much harder to consider friction in complex interactive systems. And as you all are well aware, the educational ecosystem is highly complex. So it's really tempting to simplify the problem into the equivalent of a free body diagram, where we focus on a singular problem to solve, and we think about the forces acting on that problem. It can be very, very useful for us to do this. So for example, when we're focusing on developing AI components, we would expect that there are some design patterns we can use that will reduce friction, things that will help us to wax the skis, if you will. And what such way might be to open it up. So to make available open data for training and validation, to make available open source software for methods and algorithms, and to establish and build to interoperability standards, such as those that are being defined by the IEEE AIS working group. And indeed, some of the work of the AIS consortium is focused on exactly this. We are currently working toward building a critical mass of open source and exemplar software components for the AIS community. Less often described, but also starting to make headway, are open evaluation criteria, opening enough of the black box so that others can see and evaluate the AI and its impact on learning. And so in the AIS consortium, we are working on creating and operating an evaluation and certification service for the AIS community, especially for the conformance, compliance, and support of the IEEE standards. If you are interested in joining our efforts, please reach out to me. And with all of this good efforts, I am highly aware that our efforts might fail. I think we can all agree that the educational ecosystem is just highly, highly complex. At Edmentum, my team and I think a lot about whether and under what conditions it is appropriate for data from within our adaptive systems to interact with data and services in the larger K-12 educational ecosystem. Coming from an assessment background, our concept of validity is intricately interwoven with use. So data is typically fit for some purposes and not others. So far, existing data interoperability standards don't necessarily help us tell from the data set alone whether the data is fit for a specific purpose, or whether we can interpret that data to the level of detail required for comparisons across students, classrooms, schools, school districts, states. It doesn't consider the web of data privacy and ownership issues that we especially run into in K-12 education. And in addition, some of the open data and open source software components out there are bespoke. They're difficult to generalize across context. But for those of you who have worked with me in the past, you will know I really am an internal optimist, and the hardest work can be the very most rewarding. So today, as part of this keynote, I'm going to offer 5 challenges for us to address as we work to align components and open resources. They introduce substantial opportunity for us to do better in our pursuit of innovation in AI and education, because if we work to address them, we will more readily create a system of aligned components that not only reduce friction, but that thrive in the larger educational ecosystem and help us truly address issues of equity. Challenge number 1, what data is missing? And by this, yeah, sure, I mean, who isn't represented in the data set? I think we're all aware of the scenarios in which incomplete data sets rendered a product useless for some users. There are some infamous scenarios that I'm sure everyone is aware of. But let's dig a little bit deeper as we do this work. Let's also consider what data hasn't been collected. What data will not be collected? And importantly, who decided which data to collect in the first place? And what problems were they trying to solve? Searching for the answers to those questions, they can be important reflections of power structures in our societies. And when we talk about equity, we have to talk about power structures. I would argue that alone, data is not neutral. And I would also make the claim that it is not objective, because it is the product of these decisions that are made along the way. So as you start to think about open data sets, what will you decide to prioritize as you build? You'll be building synthetic data sets, potentially simulated data sets. What semantic information are you going to choose to carry along with the data, and what will you leave behind? What contextual data is important to be collecting, and what contextual data is not collected, maybe because it's too expensive or too difficult to collect? What will you deprioritize, and who will those decisions impact? Very, very important questions for us to address in this first challenge. The second challenge, what and for whom do we optimize? AI is in the business of optimization. Every day when we are working on our AI systems, we are purposefully optimizing for something, but we have to get very, very explicit about what that thing is. In 2013, the results of an international Delphi study were released in the Journal of Computers and Education. It was authored by Plesch et al. The purpose of the study was to identify areas of tension in the advancement of technology and enhanced learning. It called upon a large sample of experts from learning sciences, psychology, computer sciences, and educational technology. Out of this study, an area of tension emerged, opposing individualized learning to standardized learning paths. And it wasn't a simple matter of who was more progressive or who was more conservative in relation to technological changes. The latter position typically in this study reflected aspects highly relevant to implementation in actual educational contexts and practices. And indeed, in recent studies, when we examine the teachers' use of adaptive instructional systems in classrooms, we find that they are often relegated to supplementary instruction, with usage far lower than the providers of those solutions advise to see positive effects. Time is seen as a serious constraint to teachers' use of these systems, along with other challenges, such as should we be providing interventions for students that are connected with the curriculum versus disconnected? This is a topic that is very often discussed in intervention literature. And so indeed, coherence among what is happening in the classroom, in our instructional technologies, and in the systems which establish what it means to be successful is going to be paramount. How do we achieve that? I think that we can start by getting explicit about what a given AI solution is meant to optimize. So let's think about it. Mastery versus opportunity to learn, a test score at a given future point in time, the speed with which a learner grows. We have to get very explicit in this as we work toward opening up methods and algorithms. And that takes us to the third challenge. What are we going to accept as evidence that it works? So if we can get clear on what we are optimizing and for whom, we should then be able to test our theories of change. What is a theories of change? Well, it is fairly simple. It describes the causal relationships from an enabler, which is, for example, our AI-enabled system, to actions that are taken as a result of having that enabler. So what might a teacher do because they have access to this AI-enabled system, to short-term, mid-term, and long-term goals. In the US, we have something called the What Works Clearinghouse. It gives very explicit guidance on how the effectiveness of an educational intervention can be established. The gold standard is a randomized control trial that takes a baseline measure and compares differences in control to intervention samples on the same measure following intervention. These studies, the most simple of these studies, typically cost around $200,000 US. And I suggest that one of the components for this group to consider in terms of removing barriers to AI in education is to consider the infrastructure required that could streamline these types of studies. It isn't easy, as evidenced in conversations at the National Council on Measurement in Education last week. Once we know which outcomes are the ones that we measure that matter, how well can we and do we measure those outcomes? How sensitive are those measures to the interventions that we want to test? As we think about our AI tooling, how do we weigh the consequences of false positives and false negatives? How do we work alongside our open code, representing implementations in which a solution has worked or has not worked? Can we be brave enough to point to the things that didn't work, or to share when we don't really know if a particular solution will work in a particular context? In AI, we often strive for incrementally better predictive accuracy results. But please, let's not stop there. Let's work to finish the story about what works for whom and under what conditions. And that brings us to challenge number 4. So if we look around our virtual room today, think about who is here, who is represented. I don't know if you've seen Hamilton, the musical Hamilton, but who gets to be in the room where it happens, right? Who decides on which components are going to be important? Who decides what it means to align them? Who decides what we strive for in optimization and how accurate is accurate enough? Who decides which data assets are going to be valuable enough to go through the work of opening them up? And who's going to decide which data assets are not? Who is going to be deciding on which questions to answer and the designs for the solutions? And in who is deciding what values are going to be implicit. So let me give a simple example. According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, today women earn only 18% of computer science bachelor's degrees in the United States. The ratio of women to men working in computer science related professions has declined since the 1990s, and we're now at about 1 in 5. How would our implementations for AI in education shift and change if there were more women contributing to building the solutions? And I could take out women and I could plug in any number of other intersectional identities of people that may not be in the room where it happens. And we need to think about how to be more inclusive. Alyssa Wise at NYU recently published a paper called Subversive Learning Analytics, and I highly recommend reading it if you haven't already. It includes a call to action for considering and explicating the assumptions and values in our learning analytics solutions. And I would argue that many of those actions would be appropriate for us to apply when we think about our AI tooling. In addition, emerging now are also frameworks for ethical AI in education. This past March, the Institute for Ethical AI in Education released a very creatively named the Ethical Framework for AI in Education. But some of the items in that framework point to being able to explicate decision-making in the development of AI, in addition to being able to describe the impact of the AI. It's really hard. I work to hire a diverse team with many perspectives. I work to bring perspectives of others into our work. We have to keep working toward bringing more people, perspectives, and priorities into the room where it happens. And finally, that leads us to challenge number 5. At Edmentum, we have a set of values we describe as #educator-first. This means that we consider and involve the educator in all of the work that we do. So as you start to think about aligning components, reducing friction, opening up resources, think very carefully about how the humans are going to play in that environment. So where are they? How are you purposefully building humans into the loop? What are your assumptions about the role and agency of the teacher, the role and agency of the student, and the roles and agency of other actors within our educational ecosystem? How can we and do we embed human-centered design into our practices? And how can we make sure that we are testing individual components in our aligned systems with humans in the loop? I think that this is probably one of the hairiest challenges, because when we think about scaling, having more humans in the loop, it's difficult to consider from a cost and a time perspective. But I think that if we leave it out, we are going to build things that maybe aren't solving the right problems. So I just presented 5 things. Call them considerations, difficulties, challenges. I prefer to call them opportunities as we work to align resources to spur innovation. So consider what data is missing. What and for whom are we optimizing? What will we accept as evidence that it works? Who gets to decide? And how will humans play? Put very simply, let's not forget for whom we work. There is a saying that you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make her drink. Fast isn't everything. No matter how quickly we get the horse there by digging in our spurs, if the water doesn't taste good, she won't drink. So we can spur innovation on AI tools that don't solve the important problems, that don't represent the people using those tools, and worse, that make decisions that have disastrously negative consequences for individuals and communities. Or we can purposefully and inclusively address the 5 challenges I shared with you today as we go. So in addition to accelerating development with a spur in the side, let's also be sure that we're making the water taste good. Thanks all, and I'm really looking forward to the next part of the discussion.
Well, thank you, Michelle. That was excellent. We really appreciate your time and energy and thoughts that you have shared with us here today, and your 5 opportunities. Make sure we use the correct language, 5 opportunities going forward. As we transition, if you want to stop sharing, Michelle, as we transition off to our panelists, I want to remind the attendees that you can use the chat feature to drop in any questions that you have, and we will bring them forth at the conclusion of the panelists. And one thing we try to do also is we will conclude today's session after we go through the panelists and discussion, and then as we stop recording, we will allow folks to stay and unmute you, and you can just have discussions then as with the panelists and keynotes as their schedules allow with today's session. So again, if there are any questions that come in, I'm not seeing any right now specifically for Michelle, but again, I think those 5 opportunities are things we should keep in mind as we move forward with our, oh, hold on, let me get the right screen up. I apologize, having a little technical issue here as a facilitator. Just a minute. And for Xavi over in Spain, I can say uno momento, por favor. Great, get the correct screen up. And so when we do our next generation by design sessions, we typically have a keynote who sets the agenda and vision and gives a little opportunity kind of perspective. And then we bring in individuals who can talk about an area of expertise and share for a shorter amount of time perspective on the topic area. So today we're fortunate to have Jim Larimore, who's the Chief Officer for Equity and Learning at RID Labs, join us, and he'll talk more about the work they're doing to support the spurring of new tools in the marketplace with challenges and use of open data. And then my co-founder and colleague, Jeff Merriman, will talk about aspects of the open infrastructure and opportunities there, similar to building off of some of the things that have been spoken about previously by Michelle and Jim. And then we're going to open it up for questions and discussions from the group. So with that, I am going to stop sharing, and again, remind you to put your questions right in the chat, and I'll ask Jim to pick up from there and take control of the screen.
Okay, terrific. Dale, thank you very much for that. I'm going to try my hand at sharing my screen so that I can share some slides with you all. Okay, so are the slides up on the screen for what you can see?
They are up on the screen. They're, if you can maximize them somehow would be the only thing. It's, I think that's the PDF version, so it's not quite a full screen.
Okay, great. Yeah, this may be a little tricky, or at least it's slow to respond on my screen. I'll try to go a little, at least bigger for that. Okay, great. So I hope that that is better, or at least passable.
It's better, it's passable, better and passable.
Okay, thanks. And I apologize for my kind of rudimentary tech skills. I'm an educator, a career educator in post-secondary education, and a sociologist by training. So I think my Zoom skills are not yet up to par for where they ought to be. I want to start off, by seeing if I can get that not to be highlighted. I wanted to start off by telling you how RID Labs came to have 3 I's in the middle of its name, which is quite an unusual spelling in any language. And the background on this is that our parent company, RID, which is based in South Korea, the name came together as a reflection of the founder's aspiration, kind of his sense of what should serve as a North Star for the work that we're doing. So his decision, his kind of commitment was to use artificial intelligence to remove inequality, inefficiency, and inconsistency from education. So remove inequality, inefficiency, and inconsistency. Those are the 3 I's in our name that remind us on what we should be focused every day. Okay. When we look at education and inequality around the world, we start with the assumption that talent and potential are pretty evenly distributed across the world's population, but that opportunity and access to quality education is not. And the data tells us that countries that have invested more equitably in public education have maintained or increased social mobility, leading to economic growth, gains in productivity, increased social stability, and higher levels of innovation. In our work, we recognize that equity in learning is an issue in every nation, but there may be different challenges and obstacles in different places. In some Asian countries, for instance, there's an overheated reliance on private education and expensive private tutors, which advantages some to the disadvantage of others. In the US, income inequality and unequal school funding, which is tied to our reliance on local taxes, local property taxes, to fund local schools, has created a system with deep structural inequalities. In Africa and Latin America, more than 50% of students currently fail to meet minimum standards in math and reading, presenting significant barriers not only for individuals, but for entire regions and nations. And the COVID pandemic that we've all struggled through over the last 15 months has revealed some deep underlying inequities in terms of a digital divide, but also exacerbated some of the education problems that we all encounter. Basically, though, those fortunate enough to have been born into more privileged families have access to supports and resources that other people cannot even imagine. And where inequalities exist in our schools, the poor find themselves trying to climb a series of broken, even disconnected ladders to reach a goal that can seem beyond their reach, no matter how hard they try. At RID, we believe that technology can be used to help close gaps in equity, opportunity, and achievement. And our strategy, our theory of change, to borrow from Michelle Barrett's presentation, is that we can serve as a field catalyst. We can work with others or help bring together and organize the efforts of others to create a collaborative marketplace for ideas, standards, and a shared framework for action. And we believe that bringing together innovators, educators who are committed to equity and improvement, and funders and other social influencers, that we can pull together a cross-sector group that can identify and overcome obstacles to progress and tackle really challenging failures in the current educational marketplace. And in the world of AI, as Michelle alluded, one of the biggest obstacles is access to large amounts of high quality, well-labeled education data, which is why in 2020, about a year ago, we used RID's data to create EdNet, or the EdNet dataset, and made it publicly available. EdNet is the largest publicly available hierarchical education dataset in the world, 20 times larger than the assessments dataset that was previously the largest. And if a small startup company can do this, we hope that others will follow suit and join us so that we can all work together to accelerate growth in the use of AI to drive improvements in learning. The education dataset, the EdNet dataset, includes data on more than 1 million learners and more than 130 million learner interactions drawn from RID's original work in Korea and subsequently in Japan in preparing students to take the ETS TOEIC exam, the test of English for international communications. But putting that data out for the world to use, we saw as only the first step. So last fall, we leveraged the data set for a competition hosted on Google's Kaggle competition platform. And working with partners like the DXtera Institute and Edmentum and others, our initial hope was to attract at least 1,000 competitors from the global AI talent pool to work with our data. And when the competition ended or was brought to a close in December of 2020, we were surprised. The RID AIED challenge had attracted more than 4,000 competitors on more than 3,000 teams from more than 100 countries, proving to us that global AI talent can be engaged in addressing challenges in education if we can provide access to data and focus the attention of AI talent on problems and challenges that we believe can lead to educational improvements. So our next step in the right side of this slide was to host a special day-long workshop in February of 2021 as part of the annual Association for the Advancement of AI conference. That workshop brought together innovative educators, companies, AI researchers, and funders to increase our understanding and our shared conversation about challenges in education that need increased attention. And the workshop allowed us to advance the cross-sector conversation that is so necessary about topics like data standards, data security, privacy, data access and interoperability, and the appropriate uses of AI. And all of these things are necessary if we are to harness the potential that these new technologies present, which can be used, we believe, for the greater good. So with that, I'll close my comments for this morning or to this afternoon or evening, depending on where you're located, by just saying that I'm honored to be with you all today and to have the opportunity to think together with you about ways that open data can spur the market to innovate and create tools that are so desperately needed in the world. Thank you for the opportunity to be with you today.
Thank you, Jim. Appreciate your comments and your additions to this presentation today. If you want to stop sharing as we transition, thank you. I will remind folks to drop in questions into the chat, which we'll get to after Jeff's presentation. And coming up, I will say there are a couple of you that might see a repetitive nature to some presentations. We did a session earlier this morning with colleagues over in Europe with the Edge Cloud Alliance and the Mindtrek conference. It got rescheduled from a previous date, and so we are. There is some similarities in some presentations going today. So apologize for that for you. But it's all good information. With that, I want to welcome Jeff Merriman, my co-founder and the CTO at DXtera, to continue on and talking about some of the other opportunities to reduce friction and spur innovation. Jeff.
Right, thank you. So I'm going to talk about work we're doing in DXtera that is leading to the ability to access a lot of really interesting, valuable data and some of the barriers and ideas that we're pursuing to figure out how that might open up. So first of all, I'm just going to say that Dale already sort of talked about what DXtera does. We have various kinds of solutions around data management, data integration with legacy systems, which typically have proprietary information. And we have a set of very rich business models for which we can extract and transform data from proprietary systems into basically operational models that reflect what's in those systems. And if you go to DXtera.org, you can find more about this. And we're using the actual specs we're using are called the Open Surface Interface definitions. And you can find information
Jeff,
about those.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, Jeff. We've got a comment that it's hard to hear you. So either maybe speak up a little bit.
Okay. Is it hard for everybody to hear me? Dale, are you having trouble hearing me?
I'm hearing you okay, not great,
okay.
But okay, but there are a couple that are
I will slow down and, okay, thanks.
Thank you.
So again, if you want to get an idea of the models we're using to do what we do, these are a couple of good resources. And these are very, very extensive models that reflect how most operational systems work in an educational enterprise. And one of the solution suites that we have created with our members, including Community College System of New Hampshire, I think Ken Asai is on the call today, is a set of tools for data management that basically run all the way through extracting data from campus systems, data silos we call them here, legacy systems, new systems, whatever they are, wherever that data is, into places where we can actually begin to take advantage of it. So our integration framework, all based on our service specifications, an enterprise data hub that really is an operational data store that can reflect the operational data across various systems on campus, our data warehouse that provides reporting tools, traditional sort of data warehousing type reporting across these sorts of data. And then of course the ability to access legacy data through more modern services through our service hub. So these are all things that we've been working with our members to create and to bring to the market and make it easy to use. They're all based on open technologies. They're all licensed openly, so people can use them. But I want to focus in on the kind of information that we get access to that a campus can access through its enterprise data hub, through these integrations. And it really is very broad. And this is really just looking at the educationally related data. It doesn't count the HR systems or financial systems or the other enterprise systems that are sort of typical in our educational organizations. But things around what are the courses and programs that are offered? What credentials can somebody get? Who are the people in our organization, both students and faculty and everybody? What are the sub-organizations within our environment? Things around registrations, students registering for courses, students registering for sections or laboratories, enrolling in programs to pursue a degree, assessments they're taking, that might come out of an LMS environment, others might come out of an SIS environment. Learning objectives that are related to our courses and programs, competencies and skills related to those learning objectives, proficiencies students might have, and finally, things around academic records. What are the courses that students have enrolled in or completed, and programs that they're pursuing, credentials they've gotten. All those kinds of things make up the scope, and there's actually growing every month or so. We're adding more information to these data sets that are coming from various kinds of enterprise systems. And again, these reflect operational data. They've been transformed to a common model, but this isn't data that's been acted upon. This is data that could be acted upon for various kinds of things. I'm going to change it to red because it is real data, and we've already talked. Michelle already mentioned, that there's a lot of risk involved when we're dealing with real data. This is data that, when we work with our members, they help us to understand exactly what the rules are around the data, what the authorizations to access it are, where that data should reside, typically in their own secure environments, because it's all personally identifiable, and there's a lot of reasons why we don't want that to get out. But it's also highly authentic. Typically for a medium-sized sort of institution in the United States with maybe 8 to 10 years of historic information about student progress, we're talking about tens of millions of database records from various systems. We're looking at 30 to 40 for the kinds of things we're currently getting. So for one institution, and that's really interesting data for the purposes of trying to take advantage of it. I'm going to move that over there. And again, authenticity is really important. So if you're developing an AI tool, you want to be able to train against authentic data, then basically act back upon data as it comes in. So train against, say, 10 years of historic information about all the students and their activities. For instance, here's one student's journey. I think we're all familiar with this. Might include entering into a educational degree program, starting to take classes. In this graphic, the little colored bars are classes that, green ones are ones that were completed. Red ones maybe weren't completed, had to be tried later. Maybe the student dropped out for a while, took some classes somewhere else, came back and entered into a new degree program that was more suited for them. But all those little bars are, have various kinds of data associated with them. Enrollment data, registration data, data that actually ended up showing up in an academic record, data that didn't. And this is all stuff that we can get access to. And if we could, most AI tool developers or semantic or developers of tools doing data analytics want to train on that kind of data across lots and lots of students over some period of time, and then those tools can begin to act on real new data as it becomes available in the system. And something we started talking about a year ago was around the time RID Labs joined DXtera, was the barrier to market entry that this sort of throws up for people who are trying to develop new tools. AI researchers, researchers in data analytics. It could be a startup company. It could be a research in a lab at a college or university. But usually the access to real, authentic data is difficult because of the risk. So if you're within a college or university or a school district, maybe you have a researcher, you might be able to more easily get access to that data. Sign away your life that you're not going to share it outside the environment. If you're a company or a startup, you almost have to make the sale to an educational organization before you can even start looking at their data. There's such a high bar, and a high bar for good reason. So what we're trying to figure out are there ways, particularly since we're sitting with our members, we're helping them to extract really valuable data from many, many systems that we can orchestrate across. Are there ways that we can provide more open access to authentic data to try to reduce those market barriers? One thing we look at is transforming real data into anonymized data. maybe even including encryption, homomorphic encryption, other techniques to decrease the risk of this data, but keep the high level of authenticity that we actually can use to train an AI tool or an analytics algorithm or whatever that might be, and also then to test or demonstrate those tools in a way that you test for effectiveness, but also demonstrate to a new customer that, hey, this kind of works. I might do something interesting. The ability to add this data to a thing like the RID AI challenge is a good example of the things you might want to do. And we have this own problem with our own tools, even though we're not really doing AI per se. We have with our data warehouse offerings. We need to be able to demonstrate that to institutional researchers. We have no way to do that from a product demonstration perspective without making personalized and personally identifiable data available. The other thing the question though is, can we actually anonymize data in a way that we can truly trust it? The people who actually steward that data can trust that it's been anonymized or encrypted in a way that it is safe to be in the wild, as it were. Michelle already mentioned this notion of synthesizing data. Is there stuff we could do? Are there ways we could take what we know about real data? We already do some of this. We can combine real open data, like maybe the courses and programs offered through, I don't know, community colleges in New Hampshire or something like that. That should be relatively open, and then then create some synthetic people. But how do we actually create really authentic connections between those people and that data to actually get back to a sort of a set of reasonable learning pathways? We haven't found a good way to do that. Not saying we won't keep trying, but these are the kinds of things we look at. Right now we don't feel that's an efficient way to train or test demo because of the lack of authenticity in those systems. Maybe some combination of all these might be helpful. Are there things we can do to increase trust in algorithms we might create to create anonymized open data from real data? Are there ways we can increase authenticity of synthetic data? Are there ways that we can combine these approaches into something that would be useful for various aspects of the industry and to lower these kinds of barriers? So we started talking about this about a year ago amongst a number of DXtera members. We now have a sort of a subgroup within DXtera, the AIED Alliance, I think we've been calling it, to look at some of these sorts of things. We're working with our members to pursue research opportunities, to build grant funding, pursue grant funding opportunities to help us look into some of these issues and investigate what might be possible. So I guess I'll just leave by saying, if you're interested in this, please feel free to reach out to us. We'd love to have more people begin to engage with us around these particular questions. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Jeff, for sharing. And again, I hope the sound was adequate. It sounded like we had one issue, but hopefully for others that was okay. I will go back to sharing my screen as we do that. Again, thank you for the presenters and what you have shared. What we'd like to do is move into some discussion format. Again, it's not always the easiest in our virtual world. We used to have great discussions in person for structured time periods with facilitation. For today, what I'm going to do is ask the panelists and Keynote to come back on the screen. And again, if you have questions in the chat, please put those in and we'll open up discussion at the end. But we have some just prompt questions that have come through previously or that we had been talking about on our own. And Michelle already addressed kind of the opportunities in the first question, of the different components or the opportunities that we can start thinking about. But I would maybe ask Jim and Jeff, what are some things, building on Michelle's 5 opportunities, what are some disparate components or opportunities to reduce friction in the marketplace that would enable these innovations to come forward, in addition to what we've already spoken about? Is there anything else you'd want to mention or highlight in there? And maybe I'll go to Jim first and then to Jeff.
Okay, yeah, thanks, Dale. Yeah, I think there are a few things that come to my mind, and part of it has to do with the way that we tend to compartmentalize what where learning happens or how we think about it, right? So I think of the opportunity to have the learning support system or the experience content, the learning experience, and other feedback follow the student over the course of their day, which means opening up access or coming up with trust agreements so that you can manage access to resources that a student might have exposure to in school, in any out of school or after school programs that they're involved in, or in the case of where we are at this time of the academic year here in the US, for a teacher to be able to say in May or June of the school year, here's how far you've come, right? And here are some things that you might do in as little as 15 or 20 minutes a day over the course of the summer to make sure that you come back in the fall ready to learn, right? Or you can either lock in what you've already had the chance to learn, or in some cases where students might have limited access to more advanced courses, here's an opportunity for you to accelerate, right? That is tied back in to the school, so we have confidence that you've actually mastered the content, right? Mastered the learning opportunity that was present. So I think, for me, that is one. The other, I think maybe at the level of managing resources within a school or a district, I think that one of the things that we have here is that we compartmentalize by course or by teacher. And if you are able to have some comparable data from across the several teachers who might teach algebra, for instance, in the 9th grade, you might find that you have some teachers that are just consistently more effective at teaching certain portions of that class, maybe even to particular groups or types of students, in which case that information can be very helpful as you think about how do you help a math department teach all of your students more effectively, or how do you allocate teacher time a little bit differently to get the right teachers in front of the right students at the right time. So I think all of that requires contextual, kind of well-structured data on the one hand. Not every school is going to have someone able to do the analytics that might be necessary to utilize the data well. And some of that can be automated, or the tools and reporting systems can be created that would help support that. And since someone is mowing the lawn out in front of our house, I'm going to mute myself for the next few minutes.
Thanks, Jim. And Jeff, would you add anything, for a response to this one about enabling the innovations to come forward, other components?
I think it is sort of an obvious one, but it makes the risk of even more red, as it were, is that I think most people are also looking at the whole life cycle education through workforce, how can we provide better access to information about not only what a student's done, but then after they leave their educational environment and move on to the workforce, how successful have they been? There's a lot of projects trying to tackle that. It's very difficult, and a big part of that is then all the various stewards of sensitive data that have to come together and figure out how to deal with that. Obviously, on a local government level, there's various things that have been done in that space. But I think that's where kind of a lot of people want to get is yep, and you learn something. What does that mean for you?
Great. Michelle, would you add anything there, and maybe add anything else that you see? Kind of the next question: what's the biggest challenge, kind of in the near future? You've already laid out the opportunities, but what's the thing that we would use data to advance human learning? So if you want to bridge between the two questions, that'd be great.
Sure. So just reflecting on comments about like using data to think about the entire life cycle and thinking about progression from school to workforce and so on and so forth. Something that is emerging in the ethics and AI in education discussions focuses on when should aspects of people's educational records be forgettable? When should we allow something to drop? A very short personal story, I may look like I am quite successful now, but I do recall one final in college where my alarm didn't go off and I showed up to my final in my pajamas, pouring rain, and it was probably not my best moment, right? So what do we allow? What are those embarrassing moments that we all experience as humans? And how do we think about the right of our learners in these systems that are predicting and tracking and thinking about what might be good for them next? How do we let those systems forget? How do we want to build that in? And I think that that is something that we need to be very mindful of. And so, I guess that one of the biggest challenges, if you want me to kind of point to the one thing, is that we are so new in using AI in education in these kinds of situations that we have many people out there applying really good thinking to all of these different dimensions. But I will tell you, having to be in 20 conferences in the month of June just to understand where all the conversations are, what is happening, how they're coming together. I think one of our biggest challenges has to do with how we bring together all of these discussions across sectors, across academic disciplines, across industry applications, in order to kind of leverage that power of thinking, because there are situations like, maybe I want the system to forget that I showed up to that final in my pajamas one day. We need to make sure we're bringing all those voices to the table.
Thank you. Jim, you want to add to that?
Yeah, I would just first say like more reason for why I admire Michelle Barrett, right? Because you were trained as a mechanical engineer, you work in education and this kind of high level of work with data, but I think you also approach this like a philosopher or ethicist, right? And I think that we do need all of those different mindsets or ways of thinking to come together. Especially at this moment in time. And I think there are some really deep kind of questions in there about, so to whom does the data really belong? And is it, are we gathering it to preserve some kind of a historical artifact? Or are we gathering it for the purpose of scaffolding learning and trying to highlight some things that may be beneficial to a student or the people who are trying to teach them or help them continue to grow and develop? And I think that we might come to some very different decisions about how we make it possible for students to erase data from a system or to archive it in a way that that they still have access to it at some point in time. But for me, I think one of the underpinnings is that we have tended to give ownership of the data to the institutions that have been managing certain segments of a student's learning experience. And not necessarily made it easy for them or their parents to have access to it or, God forbid, control over it. And so I think that these are really important questions for us to try to get right, or at least, kind of lean into today. Your observation about the variety of different conferences and meetings that are going on, I think it to me points out that there is a need to have some group of wise people come together to think about like the development of the field and what needs to be, what kind of superstructure needs to be in place or infrastructure needs to be in place to help advance that. So it isn't just a fragmented, somewhat, kind of well-intentioned, but haphazard, kind of approach to how we move along. So cross-sector conversations, thinking across different fields. If IEEE has sorted some things out, it would be great to center on that for a bit. If groups like the Next Generation by Design or Mindtrack groups have zeroed in on a few other areas, it'd be great to get them to the table working together, and for us to then just persistently try to listen to each other and learn from each other to push things ahead.
Thanks, Jim. And I, that is a recurring theme we keep hearing over and over again, is how can we get people around this issue, talking about it, developing things that will improve the safety and the acceleration of tools into the market. but what does that mean? Not just people running crazy out in the wild, I believe I've heard twice today. Ken Asai from New Hampshire had put into the chat, the biggest barrier to this field is the lack of understanding or use of technology to promote the traditional goals of education. So thank you, Ken, for putting that in. Jeff, one of the other questions that's come up in previous sessions, and I dropped it in here, was, and you were talking about this a little bit earlier in terms of what, open data and trying to get open data sets available versus that's proprietary data. What's I guess the value, or what can we, how would that be used to improve student success and student outcomes and address equity versus the limited proprietary data?
Well, I think I might have been talking more about schema rather
You
than
were
data.
Sorry. You were. I pulled that in from a previous session, so I don't mean to confuse the matters.
Yeah, so open data models as opposed to proprietary data models. A lot of vendors, particularly a lot of the real legacy vendors, tend to hold their data models close, and there's not much you can do with them because of licensing permissions and such. We've run into that. But what it also leads to, whether those models are open or not, is that there's, someone has to do some sort of mapping between models to make sure that we're talking apples and oranges in the right ways. So I think one thing we do, so we have our models that we think are quite broad and able to allow us to map to the proprietary models of various vendors across various kinds of products. I think this morning at the other event, we heard about XAPI and the work being done to try to formalize some of the verb definitions around that standard for the purposes of doing things like this. So it's a big problem. I think someone might argue that, well, the AI itself should figure out these mappings, and that may or may not work. But so I think I was talking more about schema as open schemas as opposed to data itself.
Okay, that's fine. Thank you. And again, I'm mixing a little too much apples and oranges. I'm cognizant of time, but I do want to end the question and answer period. I haven't seen any additional questions come into the chat, but I'll ask people to do it one last time if there is anything else that pops up for our panelists or keynote. But I'm going to start with Jim and then go to Jeff and Michelle for the last question, which is, if you had that magic wand and could somehow interfere in the marketplace to spur this along, to enable AI tools to be accelerated to meet the goals we're talking about, what is it you'd want to see happen? So Jim, let me throw you on the spot, and then we'll go to Jeff and then to Michelle.
Yeah, I think for me, I think part of the remedy is kind of in the question, right? Which is to think about, what do we need to do to modify or create a modified marketplace, right? That either has a different set of incentives that might lead to more sharing of data, or that would figure out ways to fund the development of the schema and the crosswalk tools that I think Jeff and Michelle have both alluded to, so that we can get to a total system designed more comprehensively and to serve the needs of students and families and schools differently than is currently the case. So I think for me, it would be a matter of rethinking the idea of the way the market is currently put together, and figuring out then how do you fund the kind of collaborative work, or fill in the gaps, or alter the incentives so that we get more of what we feel or believe that we need in order to make progress and make that a more kind of durable system.
Great. Jeff, what would you do with that magic wand?
I think I sort of alluded to, wait, oh good, I'm not muted. I think I sort of alluded to it. But, if there was a way for someone like, I'm going to pick on Ken, since his name's right in front of me here on my screen, Ken Asai at CCSNH, to wave a wand and produce a set of data that, and you could say, this is what this is anonymized representation of the last 10 years of student activity within the CCSNH. If somebody like Tristan Denley could do the same thing for the Georgia State system and say, try your best with this. What can you learn from it if you're a vendor, if you're a researcher? But knowing that they could actually produce something and put it out in the wild and be able to get some benefit back from it, knowing that it was all done safely. That would be my magic wand to get started with this.
All right, thank you. Let me go to Jim first. I think you have one more point, Jim, and then we'll go to Michelle. Is that
one point, as soon as I looked up at the screen and saw Jeff's and Michelle's faces, I thought, oh, one more thing. Which is, paying attention to the headlines from about a month ago about the report from the Me2B Alliance about issues that they saw in all of the apps that are being used in education, or among many of the apps, surprising number of them that were either designed to or unintentionally leaked in student data to third parties without kind of informed consent. So I'm not a software developer, right, by training. And one of the things that I think I've picked up in previous conversations with Jeff and Michelle and others is led me to this question of, so if one of the problems is that the developers are using these software development kits that weren't designed for education, they were designed for gaming and other kind of commercial applications, then could we fund the development of an education safe software development kit, right? And what would that look like in terms of the data tools and AI tools and other things, just so that we can pull really hard in the direction that we think things ought to be moving.
Great.
So that was the final idea.
All right, and with that, Michelle, I'm going to allow you the last response to a question. Or is it, with that magic wand, what are you going to do to shift the market?
Sure, absolutely. And just to Jim's point, that software development kit is part of what the AIS consortium is working to provide within the context of adaptive instructional systems, which I know is one piece of the overall ecosystem.
Right.
If I had a magic wand, I would introduce to the dialogue and figure out a better way to connect our educators and our learners with the people who are making the decisions about what gets developed in the software. That is a very challenging problem to solve. Different languages spoken, not all different kinds of languages, different languages spoken, different semantics, different priorities, different goals. And I really believe that in order for us to be able to develop the AI tools that are safe, meaning like by whose measure are they safe? Is it that we're not leaking data, which is obviously a very important aspect, but are we making good decisions? Are we helping people improve along the course of their lives that they are wanting to build for themselves, as opposed to pigeonholing or boxing people into futures that are not where they intend to go. We have to get better about thinking about how to draw those connections and how to build an infrastructure for those connections, so that we're not relying on developers alone to need to do all of that outreach, so that we're not, we have to provide a structure there that helps people to do that better.
Great, thank you. And let me just, I'm cognizant of time. If you do have any other questions that you want to put in, please do so in the chat. We will open it up for discussion as we conclude the recording here in a moment. But I do want to just invite you all to consider joining us as a non-monetary sponsor for our symposium and series. We're doing a couple of events here in June. We have half-day sessions that are slated for the fall based on different tracks. This will be one of the tracks, which is about accelerating AI tools in education. But we would ask you to consider for your organization to join in with the others on the bottom of this list, who are the leadership group for the symposium series. The types of expectations we have for you are quite simple, which is we'd love for you to help promote or help engage with, help advise and decide upon topics and speakers. And also a chance for us to promote your organization as someone who's interested in intentionally creating the next generation of infrastructure and solutions, in this case to support AIED tools. And as Jeff noted earlier, I just brought up the same slide. We have been kind of growing a community and connecting it with other things. We're not the superstructure. And I say we, not DXtera, we as collective groups by these logos and many others. Michelle has her own network, and so we're cross-pollinating. But we want to continue to expand this to really think about how can we build that open infrastructure, and how can we enable safe AI tool development? How can we help define that? How can we engage with the users? All of the priority issues that we have here. And so if you're interested in those types of things, this is the general email for DXtera as a landing point, or any of the other organizations you saw or are here on the screen, just send us a note. And we'd love to add you in to our membership organization and the collective action that we are taking. So with that, I'm going to conclude this formal presentation. As I said before, we will allow people to stay on, and we'll try to unmute people if they just want to talk. But there may not be anyone who does that, but we'll see what happens. But thank you all for joining us today. Thank you to our panelists and keynotes. And this session is recorded and will be posted on our sites soon. So thank you very much.